Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. I am very excited to cover a chapter of a book that I just found out about this week. Just got a hold of it this week and jumped. I didn't even read the whole book. I just jumped to the sort of a key chapter, and boy, is it fire. Okay, um, we're going to get right to it. Business, real quick. Support is gratefully received at Subscribestar. Most people subscribe for a measly $5 a month, but it adds up, lets me pay my graphic designer and so forth, and buy books. Also, I'm on vacation the next 3 weeks, so no show the next 3 weeks. See you guys in July. And I think that's everything. Let's go. Okay, this is from a book called, maybe I should have stayed on the other screen. Here we go. The Money Kings, by Daniel Schulman. The epic story of the Jewish immigrants who transformed Wall Street and shaped modern America. I skipped all the origin story of how they got rich and all that, and jumped right to The Sinews of War, chapter 16, that talks about the role of these money men, Jewish money men, or money kings. Sorry, that's what they're called, the money kings. These Jewish money kings in targeting Russia in 1904 and 1905. I think you will find this very interesting. There is origin story of George Kennan. There is origin story of the American Jewish Committee. This chapter is full of stuff. It's great. I hope I have time. I'm thinking to try to just read the chapter. I mean, I've highlighted some passages, but let's just see if we can get through it. If it gets boring, I'll start skipping around to things. Let me make sure I have the chat up. Feedback's appreciated. I listen. Okay. All right. Let's go. Okay, The Sinews of War from The Money Kings by Daniel Schulman. Chapter 16. Schiff rapped his knuckles on the table, and his guests, mid-conversation, fell silent. This is Jacob Schiff, by the way. On the evening of February 6th, 1904, an elite clique of the New York Jews who called themselves the Wanderers were meeting at Schiff's Fifth Avenue manse. The group, which included a handful of financiers, lawyers, journalists, and academics, gathered monthly to puff cigars and debate the issues of the day. Present that Saturday night were Schiff's brothers-in-law, Morris Loeb and Ike Seligman, important financiers, Oscar Strauss, then serving as Roosevelt's minister to The Hague, lawyer Lewis Marshall, Jewish communal leader and scholar Cyrus Adler, and New York Times owner and publisher Adolph Oakes, that's O-C-H-S. Adler, Oakes, and Strauss were discussing the mounting tensions between Japan and Russia, whose expansionist ambitions had brought these nations to the brink of war. The roots of the conflict stretched back more than a decade to when Russia unnerved Japan by embarking on the construction of the Trans-Siberian Railway, which would eventually snake nearly 6,000 miles, linking Moscow to the port city of Vladivostok, located on the Sea of Japan and bordering Korea and Manchuria. Japan, just coming into its own as a modern power, grew more weary of Russian encroachment following the Sino-Japanese War of 1894 and 1895. During that conflict, Japan seized from China Manchuria's Liaodong Peninsula and the strategic jewel at its tip, the heavily fortified naval base known as Port Arthur. Facing diplomatic pressure from Russia and its European allies, Japan relinquished the peninsula under the terms of its peace treaty with China. No sooner had it done so than Russia stepped in to lease this valuable territory from China, also brokering a deal with Japan's recently vanquished rival to extend the Trans-Siberian Railway into Manchuria via a line called the Chinese Eastern Railway. Then, in 1900, came the Boxer Rebellion, a nationalist uprising in northern China aimed at purging foreign colonists and influences. Russia deployed troops to Manchuria, ostensibly to protect its commercial interests, but it left a 100,000-man detachment in the region after the rebellion was brutally extinguished. Years of diplomatic wrangling ensued, but now a deadline for Russia to withdraw its troops had passed, and talks between the nations over dividing up territory in Korea and Manchuria had stalled, On the same day the wanderers met, Japan formally severed diplomatic ties with Russia, escalating the standoff. Gentlemen, I have something very serious to say to you, Schiff said gravely as the room went quiet. Unlike Oakes and Strauss, who thought the conflict could be diffused, Schiff was certain war was imminent. He had been approached about financing it. The question has been presented to me of undertaking a loan for Japan, he said. I would like to get your views as to what effect my undertaking this would have upon the fortunes of the Jewish people in Russia. Cyrus Adler recalled this episode nearly 2 decades later in a letter to Schiff's son, as Adler compiled material for his 2-volume biography of Schiff. Adler didn't record what ensued after Schiff broached the topic of bankrolling Japan, but surely the discussion was animated as the group debated the possible consequences of going to war with the Tsar. Would he retaliate against his Jewish subjects, worsening their already bleak existence? While the wanderers debated, a flotilla of Japanese destroyers secretly cruised toward Port Arthur. Just after midnight on February 9th, this is 3 days after this evening with Peter Schiff and the Wanderers, February 9th, the warships slipped into the mouth of the harbor, took aim at the anchored Russian fleet, and loosed a salvo of Whitehead torpedoes. The 18-month war that followed, in which Schiff played a decisive financial role, formed one of the most fascinating chapters of his storied career. It contributed to his legend as a fearless titan with few equals, undaunted by deploying his financial resources in righteous battle. But this period was also the tinder from which numerous conspiracy theories later erupted, including some that formed part of the Nazi canon, concerning Schiff's part in the eventual overthrow of the House of Romanov and the supposed monolithic financial power of the Jews. His decision to intervene would shape the destinies of Russia and of Japan, of Schiff himself and of the Jewish people in ways he scarcely could have imagined. You'll note in this chapter, in a way that I find quite amusing, it lays out just how pivotal Schiff was to the events, and then occasionally makes a note that, some people have really exaggerated his influence. Well, okay, I'm sure his influence was exaggerated, but the whole chapter is about how his influence warrant nothing. Okay. 3 months after the start of the war, Schiff stopped off in London as he returned to New York from a visit to Germany. On May 3rd, he attended a gathering at the home of banker Arthur Hill, a partner in the Spire's London banking operation. When dinner was served, Schiff took his seat beside Takahashi Korikiyo, the 50-year-old vice governor of the Bank of Japan, who was scouring the West for loans to finance his country's costly war. Remember Takahashi. Very interesting comments from this fellow. Coming soon. Short-bearded and round of face and physique, Takahashi was nicknamed Daruma because of his likeness to the traditional Japanese dolls representing the 5th century Buddhist monk Bodhidharma, and considered a good luck symbol. Takahashi, who would later serve as Japan's prime minister, had climbed from humble origins to the top of his country's financial and political elite. Born the illegitimate son of a Kano school artist in the court of the shogun and a teenage maid, Takahashi had learned English as a boy from missionaries. His peripatetic formative years had included a period of indentured servitude in Northern California, where he had traveled to continue his language studies. His English fluency enabled him to rise through a series of bureaucratic posts, including a stint as head of Japan's fledgling patent bureau, and it made him an ideal candidate for his vital financial mission to secure war funding, though his assignment was proving frustratingly difficult. Before traveling to London, Takahashi spent 5 dispiriting days meeting with top bankers in New York, where he found plenty of sympathy for Japan's cause, but no interest in floating its bonds. Partly, this was because U.S. bankers were at that time more focused on channeling capital into American industry and had little experience handling foreign loans. But it was also because American financiers, like their counterparts elsewhere in the world, believed Japan stood little chance of defeating the powerful Russian Empire. Takahashi had higher hopes of drumming up financing in London, since a couple of years earlier, the British had entered an alliance with Japan, but there too he found support for Japan's military struggle and reticence about bankrolling it. During my pourparlers with British bankers, Japan was often likened to a promising young man who had chances of success as well as of collapse, while it was thought that Russia was like a landlord whose mortgage would remain safe irrespective of momentary vicissitudes, Takahashi said. Through pluck, persistence, and personal connections, he eventually cajoled a few banks into coming on board, including the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank Corporation, HSBC, still around, and Pars Bank, where Alexander Allen Shand, who had once employed Takahashi as a houseboy in Yokohama, managed the Lombard Street branch. The British bankers, however, were initially willing to underwrite just half of the £10 million bond issue Takahashi's government desired. They also wanted American involvement, so that the war loan didn't seem like a purely British endeavor. At Hill's dinner, attended by representatives of various banks, Takahashi explained his predicament to Schiff, who he recalled had been introduced to him simply as an American financier on his way home from a visit to the continent. Takahashi found the American banker uncommonly interested in the war as well as in the affairs of Japan, and Schiff peppered him with questions about Japan's economy and the morale of its people. Schiff's interest in the country, in fact, dated back at least to 1872, when as a 25-year-old banker with Budge, Schiff, and Company, he had chased a share of a Japanese bond issue. He believed at the time that the business might open the door to broader opportunities in the empire, which had just emerged from centuries of feudal reign, perhaps even enabling him to secure for his friend and client James H. Wilson, the Civil War general who had hunted down Jefferson Davis, a hand in the laying out of a system and building of the railroads of the Japanese Empire, as he wrote at the time. Nothing came of the Japanese business back then, but now, 3 decades later, another opportunity had materialized. The day after meeting Schiff, Takahashi received word that the Kuhn Loeb banker, Schiff was with Kuhn Loeb by this time in his story, had offered to take up the other half of Japan's bond issue, the equivalent of $25 million. Takahashi would later say he was dumbfounded by Schiff's unexpected offer, which he attributed to good fortune because of an accidental meeting. But their meeting was almost certainly not serendipitous, even if Takahashi was not aware of that fact. I'll skip a bit here because basically Takahashi misunderstood what was going on. He thought he randomly ran into Schiff when in fact Schiff had been planning this for a while. Let's see. 2 days after Kuhn Loeb officially signed on to the Japanese loan, Ernest Castle, a friend of Schiff's, escorted Schiff to an audience with King Edward VII, who expressed his gratitude to the banker and said that he was glad that his country alone was not to supply money to Japan. Okay, and then he goes on about how the many accounts say that Schiff decided on the spot, but that's not true. Okay, so investors on both sides of the ocean clamored for the bonds. In the United States, demand outstripped the supply by 5 times over. The terms were enticing. The bonds paid 6% interest and were secured to Japan's customs duties in case of default, and the timing helped. Earlier that month, Japan had notched a victory in the first major land campaign of the war, the Battle of the Yalu River, dispelling any notion that Japan would be easily defeated. The loan's success also owed to the fact that Japan had aroused significant support in the United States. Among those rooting for the country was President Roosevelt. Now, this is President Teddy Roosevelt at this time, right? Not FDR. President Roosevelt, though officially his administration remained neutral, while Russia increasingly evoked enmity. The United States had traditionally enjoyed close diplomatic ties with Russia. What changed that? But Kishinev and news of other anti-Jewish attacks had gradually turned the tide of public opinion. I'm not going to get into it, but Kishinev was an incident of violence in Russia, or alleged violence. I didn't dig into it. in Russia against the Jewish people there. By working to make sure such assaults and oppression received widespread publicity, Schiff and his allies helped to transform a mostly Jewish affront into an American one. That's interesting. So a mostly Jewish affront, with the help of money and publicity, was turned into one that was perceived as an affront to America itself. Wonder if that ever happened any other times. Okay. The huge demand for the bonds caught Kuhn Loeb off guard. Most of the firm's partners had already scattered to their summer homes. Okay, this is getting tedious. Sorry. Blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I'm going to skip about the mental illness in the Warburg family, though I thought it was interesting. Sorry, I hadn't completely decided how much this I was going to cover. I don't think I want to actually read every single word. Because, some of these people, it's called the Money Kings, right? So he's tracing a number of these individuals. I'm mostly interested in Schiff's, Jacob Schiff's major role here in targeting Russia, right? Right, okay, so it's talking about this relationship between Warburg and Schiff. Perhaps more impressive to Warburg was Schiff's decision to take up the Japanese bond issue in the first place. Though he shared his brother-in-law's disdain for the Tsar, he also recognized Schiff had assumed considerable risk to his firm's finances and its reputation if the loan did not gain traction in the United States. It was one of the characteristics of Mr. Schiff that where his sense of justice and pride was aroused, his courage and energy knew no bounds. Okay, so back to Takahashi. Takahashi was pleased but initially puzzled by Schiff's eagerness to assist his country. When other financiers recoiled, Schiff's investment in Japan seemed a bit too adventurous for other bankers, he recalled in his memoir. As Takahashi came to know Schiff better, struck by his, quote, keen sense of justice which went to the verge of severity, close quote, he eventually understood why Schiff had taken a gamble on Japan. Quoting Takahashi now. Ready? He, Schiff, had a grudge against Russia on account of his race, Takahashi said. Schiff, he noted, wanted to admonish the ruling class of Russia by an object lesson, and the country's war with Japan offered an opportunity to do so. He felt sure that if defeated, Russia would be led in the path of betterment, whether it be revolution or reformation. Some phrases here just really striking. A grudge against Russia on account of his race. Keen sense of justice. Went to the verge of severity. Over the years, many historians have scrutinized Schiff's reasons for aiding Japan, questioning whether he was driven by moral outrage or a baser instinct, profit motive. His letters from that period unequivocally reflect his desire to deliver the Tsar his comeuppance, creating the conditions for regime change. But backing Japan was also a sound, though certainly bold, business move. A.J. Sherman, a former Kuhn Loeb banker and the firm's resident historian, assessed Schiff's motivations in a 1983 article, concluding, quote, punishing the Tsar for ill-treating the Jews was only one of the factors he, as a prudent banker, had to take into account. Japanese credit was a risk, but one that a banker could measure, weigh against potential advantage, secure to some degree. Investors' money was not to be tossed away for political ends. In short, the war loans made eminent sense on purely business grounds, daring they may have been, imprudent or merely vindictive. Certainly not. Shifted more than supply, what Takahashi called the sinews of war. That's the chapter title, the sinews of war. What are the sinews of war? Borrowing a phrase coined by Cicero, who once wrote that a limitless supply of money forms the sinews of war. I didn't know that Cicero quote. That's a good one. He also exerted his influence in the opposite direction. Schiff exerted his influence in the opposite direction, starving Russia of the international financing it needed to prosecute the war. So Schiff's making sure loans are going to Japan, and Russia's not getting any of those. We'll learn a little bit more about that. Early in the conflict, Schiff wrote a long, blunt letter to Lord Nathaniel Rothschild, grandson of the founder of N.M. Rothschild and Sons, who occupied a similar role in England as Schiff did in the United States as a business and communal leader. Predicting that troubled times are still in store for our unfortunate co-religionists in the Tsar's dominion, he wrote of his hope, for their sake and Russia's, that the war would lead to such an upheaval in basic conditions upon which Russia is now governed, that the elements in Russia which seek to bring their country under constitutional government shall at last triumph. The work would be plodding, but meantime we can all help it on by making it, each as far as in his power, impossible for the Russian government, as presently constituted, to strengthen itself. So this is kind of like the sanctions, or it is an aspect of the sanctions that are on present-day Russia. Those sanctions are more thoroughgoing, but it turns out that this financing sanction by itself, combined with financial support for the enemy of Russia, was pretty effective. Okay. Dating back at least to 1892, when Schiff turned down an opportunity to finance the Trans-Siberian Railway, he had refused all Russian business. But only more recently had he taken active steps to block Russia's access to American capital. So, at least starting 1892, Schiff wouldn't loan to Russia himself, which was significant because he was a big player. But others were doing that. But now he wants to stop that as well, right? Around 1900, Russia's then finance minister, Count Sergei Witte, dispatched a St. Petersburg banker to confer with Schiff about an issue of Russian treasury notes. The banker, a baptized Jew named Adolf Rothstein, pledged Witte's cooperation in seeking to repeal Russia's anti-Jewish May laws. Schiff rebuffed the offer, telling Rothstein that promises were cheap. Until he saw evidence of reform, he vowed to bring all the influence we could command to bear against Russia, getting a foothold in the American money markets. And he had done just that. Schiff told Rothschild that he prided himself that all the efforts, which at various times during the past 4 or 5 years have been made by Russia to gain the favor of the American markets for its loans, I've been able to bring to naught. And he sought Rothschild's commitment to apply similar pressures in Europe, where Russia had in the past raised financing from its allies France and Germany. When the Russian government, wrote Schiff, when the Russian government again applies to the European money markets, as it before long must do, and to a large extent, may we not hope that Jewish bankers of influence will not again be satisfied with promises on the part of the Russian government as to its good behavior toward its unfortunate Jewish subjects, promises as readily broken as made, and not only decline cooperation, but work with all their might against any Russian loans, so long as existing conditions continue. Rothschild replied, "There's absolutely no chance of Russia getting a loan in England, either from Jewish or non-Jewish houses, and I am equally convinced that Messrs. de Rothschild, Frere in Paris could not and would not bring out a loan for Russia under present conditions." So there's, Jewish financiers, bankers across these countries, they're communicating with each other, they're coordinating to shut down financing to Russia, and it seems like they're able to have an influence on non-Jewish banking houses as well. Going into the war, Russia justifiably believed it held the financial upper hand. "The Japanese cannot resist our finances," Witte boldly asserted. "I have nothing to say of the 2 other factors, the army and the navy. Perhaps the Japanese can carry on the war 1.5, 2, at the most 2.5 years. Considering the finances alone, we can keep it up for 4 years. Other factors being left out of account, the Japanese can therefore be brought to sue for peace by their financial ruin." But it was Russia, not Japan, that soon found itself in worrisome financial condition, burning through its treasury as it flailed for financing. Meanwhile, the Russian Empire faced growing social unrest and waning morale due to mounting military defeats by the Japanese. So Schiff wants to see a change within Russia. He's bringing pressure to bear through financing Japan's military efforts against Russia and starving Russia of international capital. Recognizing Schiff's hand in its declining fortunes, the Russian government, as it had before, sought to mollify him. In June 1904, weeks after Kuhn Loeb spearheaded the New York end of Japan's bond offering, the Russian Interior Minister Vyacheslav von Plehve, the enforcer of the Tsar's anti-Jewish policies, contacted Schiff via an intermediary with the offer of a meeting to discuss measures to improve the lot of Russia's Jews. Schiff replied that he would happily sit down with Plehve and could be in St. Petersburg as soon as that fall, if the Russian government would meet several conditions. Refusing to appear before Plehve as a suppliant, he requested a direct invitation from the Interior Minister, and he also declined to enter Russia by special permission. The government would have to abolish its restrictions on Jewish American passport holders before Schiff would consider setting foot in the country. The negotiations never progressed further. The following month, a socialist revolutionary tossed a bomb into Plehve's carriage as he returned from a weekly meeting with the Tsar. Schiff called Plehve's assassination a lesson that, quote, even the greatest and most powerful, whether an individual or a whole empire, cannot sin and go unpunished, and that sooner or later justice from on high will overtake even the mightiest of nations. Okay, I think I'm going to skip a bit here. This is basically Russia trying to get loans. Okay, so Henry Grove, president of Cramp and Sons, was considering loans to Russia, I think. And let's see, he departed for St. Petersburg. Grove departed for St. Petersburg early the following year, where he discovered another American competitor circling, steel tycoon Charles Schwab. Strauss learned that Schwab had offered to accept treasury notes in payment from the cash-pinched Russian government, and he advised Grove to be prepared to negotiate on a similar basis. When Grove arrived in Russia, the country was in the early stages of a revolution. Weeks earlier, the Tsar's Imperial Guard had opened fire on demonstrators who marched on his St. Petersburg palace to deliver a petition calling for an end to the war and better wages and working conditions. The episode, in which hundreds were killed, lit the fuse on a powder keg of discontent. In the ensuing months, peasants rioted and millions of workers went on strike, bringing Russian industry to a standstill and leaving beleaguered Tsar Nicholas II to battle for control of his empire while prosecuting an increasingly unpopular foreign war. Let's see. Updates on the war and how badly it's going for Russia. Russia's credit was ruined. Japan's had never been stronger. Weeks after Japan's victory at Mukden, Kuhn Loeb floated another tranche of bonds. The response was manic. Arriving for work on March 29, 1905, Kuhn Loeb's employees fought their way through a thick scrum surrounding the entrance to 52 William Street, where their office was. The chaotic scene resembled a classic bank run, only in this case the anxious mob was clamoring not to withdraw their money, but to hand it over to Kuhn Loeb's dazed clerks. So shut up and take my money, right? Schiff gloried in Japan's military victories, tracking the war so closely that he cabled Takahashi about Russia's defeat at Tsushima before the Japanese banker had even learned this news from his own government. Mr. Schiff was gleeing with joy over the substantial successes of our arms, Takahashi said. Over the course of the war, and in its immediate aftermath, Kuhn Loeb underwrote 5 Japanese loans totaling $180 million. This amounted to more than 20% of Japan's wartime expenditures. The governments of both sides recognized Schiff's pivotal role. Before the war had even concluded, Japan's emperor awarded Schiff the Second Order of the Sacred Treasure, conferred on those who had provided distinguished service to the empire. Schiff, meanwhile, earned the special scorn the Tsar's government reserved for its most reviled enemies. Our government will never forgive or forget what that Jew, Schiff, did to us, Russia's finance minister during the conflict, Vladimir Kukovtsov, seethed 6 years after the war. Quoting again from Kukovtsov, he dealt us a terrible blow by helping our enemy, Japan, at the most critical moment of our war against Japan. He alone made possible for Japan to secure a loan in America. He was one of the most dangerous men we had against us abroad. Okay. Let's see. Then Roosevelt offers to mediate. I'm going to skip ahead a bit. Widows trying to get loans. Yeah, okay. So, in early July, prior to Witta's arrival in the United States, he met with Schiff and Seligman to test the waters for a Russian loan, or Greg Willinkin did, Witta's deputy. Willinkin met with Schiff and Seligman to test the waters for a Russian loan if the peace talks succeeded, proposing that J.P. Morgan and Company, Kuhn Loeb, and J&W Seligman and Company spearhead the bond issue. Later that month, Willinkin invited Ike Seligman and Oscar Strauss to a dinner party he hosted for Russia's new ambassador to the United States, Baron Roman Rosen, where the topic of a loan again came up. During their discussion with the ambassador, Seligman said they aimed to prepare Rosen's mind in advance of Witta's arrival on the Jewish question, which is so inseparably linked with the financial question on this side. In Portsmouth, he noted, they intended to impress Witta with the absolute necessity of according a more liberal treatment to the Russian Jews abroad as a sine qua non of opening our markets to Russian securities. Let's see. Let's see. As the meeting with Witta approached, Schiff confessed misgivings in a letter to Philip Cohen, editor of the American Hebrew newspaper. Firstly, he explained, because I know it can do no good, and secondly, because I do not wish to have it said that I went to discuss Russian finance with Mr. Witta. He continued, there is only one thing we can do, to give as hard knocks to Russia as we can, whenever opportunity offers, to accept no promises in return for our aid as bankers when this is asked for, and to do nothing for Russia until she has actually given civil rights to her Jewish subjects. But Schiff did go. Let's see. And this is Schiff, right? Yeah, so Schiff didn't. So Schiff meets with Witta. And Willinkin, I guess, must be a Jewish guy from Russia. Anyway, so the Jewish delegation raised the massacre at Kishinev, how the attack had outraged the civilized world, and said that Russia would not regain the goodwill of the American people or tamp down the discord with its own borders until it afforded equal rights to its Jewish citizens. Even while his colleagues attempted to temper his remarks, Schiff did not hold back, jabbing a finger at Willinkin, pointing a finger at Willinkin, who's Jewish, I assume. He pointedly asked Witta, will you please tell me why you, as a Russian, have full rights in your country, while he, also a Russian, has none? Witta did not bother to defend his government's anti-Jewish policies, but also said that, quote, the horrors of the Jewish situation in Russia had been presented to the world in a somewhat exaggerated light. He agreed that anti-Jewish restrictions should be removed, but he felt this should happen gradually. Moving too quickly, he said, might fuel the Russian Empire's internal upheaval. He claimed that Jews were leaders of the revolution and that the Tsar could scarcely be expected to ameliorate conditions for Russian Jews while his throne was under siege. He suggested to Schiff and his colleagues that they exert their influence to convince young Jews to remain loyal to the Tsar, who would then be more likely to help the Jews. We have no such influence, Schiff scoffed. The influence must come from within, not without. And is it not probable that the young men became revolutionists in the hope that a republic will grant them just laws which are denied under the rule of the emperor? Um, okay. Right. So, okay. So then Schiff cabled a full account of this meeting with the Russian ambassador, or with Witta, to the American Hebrew's Philip Cohen. He says, please don't use my name as an informant. He instructed the journalist. And then here's what he gave him for the press, I guess, or for the Jewish press. Witta, most liberal and sympathetic, but fears anything but gradual removal, disabilities, and practical. We honestly sought to impress him with necessity, prompt granting full civil rights, and stated without reserve that unless this granted, the steadily growing Jewish influence in America would be thrown against Russia. We feel we have made an impression on Witta personally. Whether this will have any effect on Russian government future must show. Okay, so this is Schiff himself describing steadily growing Jewish influence in America, which, could be used to be thrown against Russia, basically saying that they can influence America in foreign policy, right? Notice, though, he says steadily growing. As I think we'll see, it's quite clear that in 1904, 1905 here, or in this period, there's not this kind of powerful influence that the Israel lobby currently has. They're not quite to the point that it got to later, though it's, I have to say, they were able to have a lot more influence than I expected this long ago. I thought, Jewish influence in America had started a little bit later, or had become really significant a little bit later. But I would say what we find out in this chapter tells us that even in 1904 and 1905, very strong influence in foreign affairs and finances and so forth, which turns out to, if you control the financing, seems like you can have a lot of influence. Surprise, surprise. Okay. Oh, this is an interesting observation from Witta. The Russian could not help marveling at Schiff's bravado, even while he considered the banker's behavior at times antagonistic, even belligerent. I have never before met just such a Jew as Schiff, Witta recounted years later. Proud, dignified, conscious of his power, he declared to me solemnly that so long as the Tsar's government would continue its anti-Jewish policy, he would exert every effort to make it impossible for Russia to get a kopeck in the United States. He banged the table with his fist and declared that a government which indulged in massacres and inhuman persecution on religious grounds was not to be trusted, that such a government was a blot upon civilization and could not last long, for it carried within itself the seeds of destruction. Let's see, then somebody tried to kill Schiff with a letter bomb. Let's see. Okay, at 4 p.m. on August 29th, a cacophony of church bells, factory whistles, and sirens sounded throughout Portsmouth. The sound of peace. After nearly a month of intense negotiations, the Japanese delegation announced it would accept Russia's terms. To Witta's surprise, Japan backed down from its demand for reparations, one of the final sticking points. Under the terms of the treaty, Russia relinquished the Liaodong Peninsula and its railroad interests there, and both countries split the contested island of Sakhalin, with the southern half going to Japan. That afternoon, Witta, looking drained but elated, was spotted embracing Baron Rosen and kissing the ambassador on both cheeks. 4 days earlier, Schiff had sent a forthright letter to the Japanese plenipotentiary, Baron Komura, nudging his government to strike a deal with Russia. Let's see what this nudging looks like. He assured Komura that Kuhn Loeb stood ready to assist Japan, whatever the outcome of the talks, but he warned that other bankers would not look favorably on a decision to resume the war, and that the money markets of the United States, England, and Germany will no longer be prepared to finance Japan's requirement to any great extent. The reason this was so striking to me is that, financing seemed to be really key at the beginning of the war, and now it seems to be really key, and, they were done with the war, I guess, or whatever, and now they're going to just turn it off. Turn it on, turn it off, right? Okay. Oh, and this is interesting. Um, okay, I'm just going to go ahead and read this. After learning peace was at hand, Schiff sent a congratulatory cable to Takahashi, Banzai. Schiff also fired off another message that day, this one to James Stillman, president of the National City Bank, where Schiff held a board seat. The rumor on Wall Street was that Stillman was mulling joining a Russian loan syndicate organized by J.P. Morgan and Company. Politely but firmly, Schiff made clear where he stood. While I wish in no way to interfere with what may be considered the interests of your stockholders, he wrote, it is but right that I should say to you, if the report is correct, self-respect will necessitate my withdrawal from the board. So adamant was Schiff against financing Russia that when the topic came up at a meeting of top New York bankers, he rose from his chair and announced that he had forbidden his firm to have any dealings with Russia, not just during his lifetime, but in perpetuity, so long as its anti-Jewish policies persisted. Japan's war with Russia had concluded, but Schiff's continued. So the war with Japan that he helped finance, was just one part of what he was doing to go after Russia, right? When during their morning meeting in Portsmouth, Witte had asked Schiff to use his influence to help pacify the revolution roiling his country, and Schiff had demurred, what Schiff didn't say was that he had taken direct steps to fuel the uprising threatening to bring down the Russian autocracy. In the months leading up to and after the Portsmouth Peace Conference, he bankrolled a propaganda campaign aimed at sowing anti-Tsarist sentiment among Russian prisoners of war, in the hopes that those soldiers would join the revolutionary ranks when they eventually returned home. I don't know if you're familiar with this sort of maneuver. It's quite common State Department type thing. I'm thinking of the MEC with Iran. You have people who used to be in that country. You want to have regime change, and so you are training these people with the intention for them to go back into the country and help foment revolution, right? So we're going to learn more about this exercise. Okay, Japan's Okay, the effort was the brainchild of George Kennan. Ever heard of him before? The journalist whom Schiff had befriended through their mutual involvement in the Society of Friends of Russian Freedom and its journal, Free Russia. After the war broke out, Kennan traveled to Japan to cover the conflict for Outlook magazine. Early on, he toured the prison camp at Matsuyama with other foreign correspondents, a visit arranged by the Japanese government, which wanted to show the world that it was treating Russian POWs humanely. Kennan interviewed some of the prisoners who expressed one main complaint, the crushing boredom. They had nothing to do, nothing to read. I'm ready to read even cookbooks and arithmetics if they're only in Russian, one inmate told him. An idea. Kennan saw an opportunity to bring comfort to the Russian soldiers while simultaneously enlightening them about the Tsar's despotic ways. So he got, he secured permission from Japan's Ministry of War to distribute subversive Russian literature, including the liberal journal Osvobождение, Liberation, among Russian POWs. Then he wrote to the New York chapter of the Friends of Russian Freedom, asking the group to send him all the Russian language material it could gather. In June 1905, the requested literature arrived in Tokyo, along with a guy originally named Sudzolovsky, a veteran socialist organizer who had fled Russia in the 1870s. So by the war's end, Japan had captured some 70,000 Russian soldiers. And this guy, whose real name is Sudzolovsky, he immediately set to work disseminating anti-Tsarist pamphlets widely throughout the prison camps. The Japanese allowed the charismatic doctor to convene mass meetings where he held forth before large groups of prisoners. He also convinced the Japanese to release into his custody political prisoners held in the Russian penal colony on Sakhalin Island. Sorry, I'm probably pronouncing that terribly. By enlisting these dissidents to help him organize Russian POWs, this guy magnified his efforts. Most of them had no money and no suitable clothes, George Kennan remembered of the political prisoners, but thanks to the powerful and wealthy friend in New York who was financing our enterprise, we were able to supply them with everything that they needed. That wealthy benefactor was Schiff. He funded most, if not all, of Kennan and Sodzilovsky's work, though his role in stoking revolutionary fervor among Russian soldiers would remain secret for more than a decade. So he's secretly propagandizing Russian POWs to send them back in to help overthrow the Russian government. This is so U.S. State Department type behavior. By some accounts, the Schiff-funded propaganda blitz was remarkably effective. In late 1905, the New York Times reported, with some apparent exaggeration, that Sodzilovsky succeeded beyond all expectation, as is shown by the fact that he organized under the banner of socialism nearly all of the Russian soldiers taken prisoners by the Japanese, who are now in detention camps in Japan awaiting transportation to their homes. Wherever they go, it is to be expected that the men from Japan will act as leaven, and that hard as authorities may try, they will be unable to eradicate the effect of the awakening which the prisoners have undergone. So, I'm sorry, let's just step back and understand what's happening here. The capitalist, Schiff, right, the capitalist banker, Wall Street banker, is providing the funds to propagandize these Russian prisoners of war with socialism from the Sodzilovsky character. Okay, so the capitalist is funding socialist indoctrination to subvert, to affect regime change in Russia. Very interesting. In a private letter to Schiff, written shortly after the Russian Revolution of 1917 finally toppled Tsar Nicholas II from power, George Kennan commended him for the, quote, very great service which you rendered to the cause of human liberty. Oh, is that what we're doing here? Okay. Rendered to the cause of human liberty when you financed the propaganda among the Russian officers and soldiers in the prison camps of Japan. Not only did you make it possible to sow the seeds of freedom in perhaps 100 different regiments of the Russian army, but you enabled Sodzilovsky and me to take care of all the Russian political convicts whom the Japanese released when they took possession of the island of Sakhalin. All of these men helped us in our revolutionary propaganda, and then returned either to Russia or to the United States. So, sad what happens here, guys. In the hands of conspiracy theorists, Schiff's wartime activities, helping to finance the conflict, bankrolling revolutionary propaganda, proselytizing, it formed the raw molding clay for a grotesque mythology of the supposedly all-powerful banker. You just wouldn't believe what people would do with the innocent things that Schiff was doing here. Okay. By the fall of 1905, the revolution had placed enough pressure on Tsar Nicholas II that he finally acceded to demands for a constitutional government. On October 17th, he issued the October Manifesto, a document heavily influenced by Witte that pledged political reforms, including the establishment of a constitution that would protect the civil rights of all Russians, Jews included. This is what Schiff was part of what he was pushing for, right? Unfortunately, Russian people weren't completely thrilled with what had happened here. Barely had Russia taken its first steps toward political reform when blood again spilled on the streets of Jewish enclaves. The war-depleted economy, coupled with the promise of equal rights for the Jews and the misguided belief they had caused Russia's hardships, sparked a wildfire of anti-Jewish violence that swept across the Pale of Settlement. Members of the Black Hundreds, an ultranationalist group that emerged during the revolution to defend the Russian monarchy, often incited the attacks, using the phony Protocols of the Elders of Zion to justify anti-Jewish rampages. Everyone's horrified and appalled. Anxious cables zipped between New York, London, St. Petersburg, and Berlin as Schiff, Lord Rothschild, and other Jewish leaders conferred on how to address the crisis and coordinated their response. On the afternoon of November 7th, 1905, Schiff and Oscar Strauss convened a mass meeting at Temple Emmanuel, where all the disparate factions of New York Jewry were represented: the Lower East Side Socialists, the Zionist crowd agitating for the creation of a sovereign Jewish state, and of course the uptown elite. So you got your socialists, you got your Zionists, and you got the Wall Street guys, the money kings, as the title of the book says. Okay, so they talked about what can we do? Let's raise some money to help the people there. Let's see. So here's where you see the limits in 1905 of the influence of, sort of the proto-Israel lobby. Brimming with indignation and despair, Schiff once again directed an impassioned plea to President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, this time going so far as to advise that the United States intervene directly to halt the Russian violence, and calling for the president to seek congressional approval to take such measures as may become advisable. He argued that if the U.S. had been justified in coming to the aid of oppressed Cubans during the Spanish-American War, is it not, in the face of the horrors now occurring in Russia, in which its very government declares it is powerless to prevent, the duty of the civilized world to intervene? Barely containing his exasperation with the hot-headed banker, Roosevelt told Schiff that his recommendation would make the United States government ridiculous and was likely to backfire, harming not just the Jews of Russia, but those in the United States. I thoroughly believe, Roosevelt told Schiff, that in national affairs we should act in accordance with the Plains adage when I was in the ranch business: never to draw unless you mean to shoot. Okay, so Schiff is able to have a tremendous amount of influence with what goes on with the war between Japan and Russia, with getting subversives in there, helping pressure a change towards constitutional government, which gives Jews, human rights or whatever. But when he goes and says to Teddy Roosevelt, basically declare war on Russia, Roosevelt's like, whoa, dude. And Roosevelt was pretty hot-headed himself, but he thought this was nuts. Okay, the Russian Revolution peaked during the fall of 1905. We're almost done, by the way. Then it began slowly to subside. In its wake, the Tsar maintained his hold on power, and the situation for Russian Jews, despite pledges of equality, remained as tenuous as ever. Bursts of violence continued, ultimately leaving thousands dead, wounded, and dispossessed. As the political status quo returned to Russia, Schiff and his allies began to rethink their tactics. The Jewish community's past approach to crises, protest meetings, fundraising drives, the intercession of well-connected Jews with political leaders, no longer seemed adequate. So when the Wanderers convened in December 1905, members of the group discussed establishing a new organization devoted to the defense of Jewish rights wherever they came under threat. This group would harmonize aid and advocacy efforts across the far-flung network of Jewish relief groups, and it would speak for the whole of American Jewry. So this is the beginning of the Israel lobby, right? This is like the pre-story of the Israel lobby. A few weeks later, in the pages of the American Hebrew, Cyrus Adler articulated their vision, writing that the affairs of the Jew throughout the world are so important to make it necessary and desirable that there should be a national Jewish organization in the United States which can, in cases of necessity, cooperate with similar bodies in other countries for the welfare of the Jews elsewhere. So February 3rd, 1906, Jewish leaders from across the country, they convened along with Schiff, members of the Upper East Side elite, mentions a bunch of names. Let me see if there's any I should mention. Cyrus Sulzberger, whose son Arthur Hayes would go on to become publisher of the New York Times because he married Adolf Oak's only daughter. So the concept of creating a committee to represent America's factionalized Jewish community was controversial. Some worried that forming what amounted to a Jewish lobby risked fueling the long-standing and pernicious charge that Jews existed as a state within a state, loyal not to the countries where they lived, but to their own people. This is the dual loyalty charge, right? They worried about raising a Jewish question in their own backyard, but the ongoing crisis in Russia ultimately outweighed fears of stoking anti-Semitism. Schiff backed the creation of a central committee. Okay, the organization that emerged from this meeting and other discussions in the months ahead was dubbed the American Jewish Committee. And let me just fact check this, because there is, yes, there is a so-called conservative journal published by the American Jewish Committee that some people might have heard of. It's called Commentary. And I remember a close friend of mine who was sort of tended to be sort of neocon. He faithfully read Commentary. It's currently let's see. Yeah, it shifted from liberal to neoconservative under the editorship of Norman Podhoretz in the 70s and 80s. It's currently headed by John Podhoretz. You might have heard those names. So American Jewish Committee, Commentary, the Podhoretzes, this is all tracing back to what we're learning about right now. I think this is fascinating. And of course, this is the beginning of, as they say here, a Jewish lobby, right? What we now call the Israel lobby pre-existed Israel. There was already a Jewish lobby, an organized Jewish lobby in the United States. Okay. Oh, that might be it. Let's see. I think this is just segueing to the next chapter. Yeah, okay. Talking about Roosevelt going after corporations and Schiff sort of supporting him, but being worried about how far. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. Okay. I hope that you found that as interesting as I did. I was blown away by some of the details revealed in that. Just wow. And I did not see it coming that this was like an origin story for George Kennan. You know, some of his early times having influence there. And, you know, him writing with the Bolshevik Revolution. I'm sorry, not the Bolshevik Revolution, but the fall of the Tsar. Him writing to Schiff and saying, "Congrats, you pulled it off. You know, you pulled off regime change." Okay, let me see any comments here real quick. Wow, why do I have so many things open? What's going on here? Okay, sorry. I opened a bunch of tabs while I was prepping the show, and no, that's not what I want. Where am I? Sorry. Usually I have all my stuff open with super chats and stuff. There? Oh, there we go. Okay. Somehow it moved from one window to another. Okay, let me see if I have anything to respond to. Okay, then I will just look at the chat real quick, see if there's any comments I want to read out or whatever. Yeah, Caravaggio says exaggerated, but also nobody is taught about it. How convenient. Yes. Okay, so here's Machiavelli, BTFOing Cicero, according to Jacob. The sinews of war are not gold, but good soldiers. But gold alone will not procure good soldiers, but good soldiers will always procure gold. Yeah, I don't know. I think this story makes one wonder how important financing is to war. Seems pretty important. And of course, limitless supply of money makes me think of the Fed, right? The U.S. Has the Fed to draw on to keep its wars rolling. And then Daniel Hall says, oppressed Cubans, peak black legend, yellow journalism stuff against the Spanish. Yeah, well, I agree with you there. And in fact, in a series on the road to empire, I think I called it, talking about the rise of the U.S. empire, I talked about the final episode of that is about the Spanish-American War, because I think at that point, unquestionably, the U.S. is an empire, you know, with holdings far away from the continental U.S. Okay, I think I'm done. How'd I do? About an hour. Okay, I think that's okay. I hope that was interesting. Like I said, I just got my hands on the book, Money Kings by Daniel Schulman. I jumped right to that chapter. I didn't even read the earlier ones. There might be more to draw out of here, but I can tell you that the book does not go up to, it'd be quite interesting for him to follow the story later, right? But I think maybe he focuses on Schiff a lot because I believe it seems to kind of wrap up with Schiff dying, which is, I'm sorry, I don't even know. Let me just look that up real quick. That'll give you an idea of how far the book takes it. Yeah, so Jacob Schiff died in 1920. Okay. Yeah, so I think this book is kind of going from the 1800s up to the early 20th century. So if there's anything else of interest about World War I, maybe that would be of interest. There's a whole chapter called I'm not going to make any further comments, but just of interest to folks. Chapter 26 is just called Henry Ford. If you know anything about the man academic agent refers to as the car manufacturer, you might guess what that chapter has to say about Henry Ford. It's not complimentary. Okay. All right. And that's it. I'm going to be off for 3 weeks. I might do a little bit more in this series. I'm not sure. Certainly this book was a find. Thanks again to the friend on Twitter who recommended it. And I will see you guys in July with something. We'll see. Okay. Thanks for your support. Really appreciate it. And see you guys next time.